What's up, fisher people? Today we're going to talk about spring walleye locations specifically for large reservoir systems like Lake Sakakawea, where I spend most of my time at my office. So if you fish big reservoir systems, definitely if you fish Lake Sakakawea in North Dakota, this should be somewhat helpful, so stick around. This feels like a nice fish, not gonna lie. Chasing pre-spawners and I feel like I got a nice one. Be the right fish for me. That is a giant walleye. Oh my word. You need to get in this net for me. Right there. Yes! There's the stuff. Right there. Now, if you watched the Natural Lakes video that I put out not too long ago, because maybe you fish both things, a lot of this stuff is going to be pretty similar, especially the first step, which is knowing where in the cycle you are. Are you pre-spawn or are you post-spawn? Have they laid their eggs or not yet? Again, walleyes tend to like to spawn in 42 to 48 degree water, but they're only going to wait so long compared to whatever that calendar date is that they typically like to do it. And I found that reservoirs almost tend to be even more sticky when it comes to those days. So if you get some really warm water or some really cold water, it might push things 3, 4, 5 days a week at most, one direction or the other, but for the most part, they're going to stick pretty close to a certain time period. And given that big reservoirs take longer to warm up, they're probably going to spawn later than they will on a lot of natural lakes in the surrounding area of where you're fishing. And there's also one other unique thing that when it comes to these big reservoir systems, it seems like for whatever reason, walleyes tend to go on maternity leave. When they start laying eggs, they seem to take at least a week, sometimes 2 weeks, completely off of at least biting the lures that I've ever thrown at them and anybody else that I've known that's thrown at them. Maybe they're eating something. They don't seem to be very catchable at all. So if you know that the spawn is hit on a big reservoir system, you might want to do something else for a while, target a different species. I think I got a different species this time, or look at a different lake. And then where are these spawning locations going to be? Well, when it comes to a big reservoir system, the lower ends of these reservoirs where things are much bigger, more sprawling, a lot more like a natural lake, you're going to want to target the bays. There's going to be a lot of creek arms that flow into these things, so they're going to want to get back into those creek arms to find that current back there. And they might still spawn on some of the areas further out from the creek arms that don't maybe have the current, but still have some nice gravel substrate that maybe has some wind typically blowing into those shorelines to keep those eggs oxygenated. So you're going to want to look for the biggest, most substantial creek arm bays on these reservoirs when you're fishing the lower end. Now, when you get to the upper end, when things start to look more like a river, there might be some bays there, but they might not be significant enough. They might not have enough structure and depth and things to really hold a bunch of fish. And at that point, they kind of turn more into almost like river spawners, and they're just going to find locations along the banks that meet these conditions. Now, again, they're not looking for big boulders to spawn. They're looking for moderate sized gravel, sometimes even sand, something that's going to have some prevailing wind hitting it or a little bit of current. And then you get further up in that reservoir system where it is a little more like a river, there's going to be a lot of current. So they're not going to be super concerned about the wind in that scenario. And they might drop them anywhere they find something that's suitable to where they want those eggs to sit. So if you're in a pre-spawn situation, you might fish these bays very similar to how you would fish them, honestly, in the late fall or even in the winter time period. They're going to be on what you would call staging locations. They might still be even hanging deep off some structure, off some points and humps and shoreline breaks, kind of close to the areas they're going to spawn, but they're not going to move in there all the way yet until they start dropping eggs. And a lot of times pre-spawn depth has to do with how warm the weather is outside of the lake at that time. So if you got a nice warm day that warms up some of that shallow water, that probably come in shallower to feed. If you don't, and you got a nice cold front, you might still be fishing them down in 15, 20, 30 feet of water on some of these deeper structures and break lines, because they're not quite into that spring post-spawn mode yet. And just like with natural lakes, the females are going to hit these spots in and out. The males might be there a little before and then a few days after or a week after, milking the eggs. So if you're finding milking males, that's probably predominantly what you're going to catch in that area. Not necessarily exclusively, but oftentimes those females will get in and out of those, whether it's the back of the creek arms, whether it's a nice gravel shoreline somewhere else in the bay, further up in the system. Males and females aren't going to hang out here a ton together until you get a little more post-spawn. Speaking of post-spawn, again, just like natural lakes, warm water is the king. And Even more so than natural lakes, these big reservoirs are going to have very large discrepancies in terms of water temperature. So if you're in a wind-blown area in the back of a bay, you might find 55-degree water, and then you run out to the main lake somewhere and find 37-degree water. That's not super uncommon, especially on Lake Sakakawea where I fish a ton. So warm water is a huge thing, but to start with, find one of those major bays where you suspect that fish were spawning. If you're in the further upper reaches of the reservoir, that's going to be a little different. You're just looking for pockets of warm and stained water wherever that happens to be. And I say stained water because stained water holds more temperature, it holds more heat. But then back down again on the lower ends, big bay. Sometimes they'll be way back in those creek arms. Other times they might just be in the intermediate spots of the bay, looking for windblown shorelines, looking for bait fish to feed on, because they're going to be hungry at this point. The spawn is well over, you're a week or two past, you start to get a few nice warm days, water temp starts bumping up towards 50, 55 degrees. It's going to be fun. And now when you're in these areas, spring is all about the flats. You want to fish flatter areas. You don't necessarily need to be fishing steep drops. You're not necessarily fishing structure like points and humps. I have found occasionally that it's nice if a flat area has a little bit of a drop in access to deep water somewhere nearby, but predominantly what you're fishing is a pretty decent sized flat area. Sand and gravel, primo spots, at least for the active fish. Now, perhaps even more than natural lakes, what I found is that there will be plenty of walleyes in 20, 25, 30 feet of water during this time period, but they're probably not going to be as active, especially if we are actually having a nice warming trend and the shallow water is much warmer. Now, there was a unique season, which happens to be last year as I'm filming this. It was 2024. It was pretty cold in the spring, and a lot of the water was the same, whether it was in 5 feet of water or 30 feet of water. So the fish were kind of scattered all over the place, almost like a post-turnover situation in the fall. And it didn't really matter what depth you were fishing, you'd pick off a few here and a few there. That's not super normal, however. If you have typical warming trends like you would see in the spring, that shallower water is going to be much warmer than what it would be 10, 20 feet down. And that's where all the active fish are going to be. Even if you're marking fish in 25, 30 feet, they're probably not going to bite so well. If you get up shallower, even if you don't have side imaging and you don't know those fish are there, if you just hit some shallow shorelines, wind-blown stuff, and cast around, you're probably going to find some fish if you're in a decent area. And to that end, I also find that side imaging is king when it comes to this time period of the year. Forward-facing sonar can have some advantages. You can see some fish in shallow water, but for identifying them, especially quickly, side imaging is so helpful to sweep the bank of a shallow sand flat and just see fish peppered all over there. You don't even need forward-facing sonar to catch fish in that situation because they will congregate so tightly. You're going to find all kinds of stuff in these big reservoirs. You're going to find the walleyes, you're going to catch bass mixed in, pike mixed in. There's going to be some garbage fish in there, the carp, the suckers, catfish are going to hang out there, all kinds of stuff. They're all using the shallow warm water. So if you're catching other stuff, doesn't necessarily mean there's not going to be walleyes there. They all want to use that nice warm flat stuff. Action is action in the spring a lot of times. The walleyes aren't going to be quite so discriminant versus other species. So yeah, if you're out on a big reservoir looking for spring walleyes, what part of the cycle are you in? Pre-spawn, post-spawn? If it's in the middle of the spawn, get out and do something else. If it's pre-spawn, think about the areas they're going to be and where they might stage nearby on some structure with some deeper breaks. If it's post-spawn, think about those spawning locations where maybe some of the males are hanging out, and then pull out just a little bit from some of those creek arms and some of the back bay areas and look for some sand and some gravel flats, warm water, stained water if you can find it, wind-blown stuff. You're gonna have a blast. Hopefully this helped. I'd love to see you catch some fish. Maybe drop a comment if you do. Hit the like button, subscribe, all the stuff. Thank you so much for watching. Appreciate it. Till next time, later, fisher people. If you enjoyed this video and you think you might want some more help breaking down one of your favorite lakes in your area, I do offer this as a service in my paid Patreon subscription, the top $50 tier, which you can find at patreon.com/Bloemendaal Fishing. And I also offer it as a one-time service on my website, which you can find at bloemendaalfishing.com. I'll break down the maps depending on times of season, give you a little help and insight, and have about a 1-hour phone call if that's something you're interested in. Keep that in mind. Now you know where to find me.